I wish we'd have been gathered 100 years ago. That was perfectly scandalous. Thank you. Modernity takes all the joy out of scandal. I like the silent church before the service begins better than any preaching, professed Ralph Waldo Emerson in his essay, Self-Reliance. Like countless other ministers, I've pondered these words while sitting alone in a church, both before and after services, absorbing the silent beauty of the sacred space. In this sanctuary are luminescent stained glass windows and the prayerful hands of the chalice. An easier task when it's occupied only by me and my highest ideals. And like almost every other minister immersed in the transcendentalist tradition that Emerson epitomized, I generally leave out the part about preaching when quoting the Sage of Concord to others. I like the silent church before the service begins. Full stop. Why tempt fate by holding out the prospect of a service without any preaching at all? The idea might catch on, and in time, the people might come to prefer the simplicity of a silent Quaker meeting to the traditional fare of a Unitarian Universalist congregation. Sitting by ourselves in the stillness of a quiet sanctuary, it's possible to imagine the potential of perfection. An ideal church that fully satisfies our conceptions of what a utopian spiritual community could be. A school of philosophers, a gathering of the saints. Looking through the panes of the stained glass windows, it's easy enough to become lost in the bright colors of the glass and the elegance of the design without noticing that the glass is cracked in places, the colors a little uneven, and the lead holding them together patched in spots. Letting our eyes settle on the hands of the chalice, it's easy to forget that real hands sometimes clutch us too tightly or not tightly enough, and that it's occasionally difficult to get the waxen wick to light and keep burning through to the end of the service. Even the apparently perfect symbols of this quiet sanctuary reveal their imperfections over time. Once you add a crowd of people, a congregation, the possibility of perfection evaporates. You're all lovely, don't get me wrong. But there's no perfection in the room, just goodness, just wonderful people, but no perfection. As an ideal, we're able to conceive of the church as an ideal place. But once you add people to the mix, real, living, breathing, imperfect people, people like you, or at least the person sitting next to you, once you add that, such illusions disappear. For in real life, churches are far from perfect places. And while they may be vessels to hold our highest ideals, I have yet to find one that doesn't leak. Sometimes religion is a little like romance. We idealize our religious communities as we may idealize the object of our love. And then we find ourselves deeply disappointed when they fail to measure up to the ideals we have projected onto them. They fall off a pedestal that we have placed them on. While church may be one of the places where we nurture our highest ideals, perhaps seek to discover them, expecting perfection will inevitably lead to disappointment. So we may do better. We may be happier together if we accept our inevitable foibles, forgive ourselves, and aspire for shared growth and development over perfection. Good enough really is good enough. During the course of my career as a minister, I have enjoyed the privilege of consulting directly with upwards of 200 congregations, most of them Unitarian Universalist congregations, but a few from other denominations. I've worked with congregations across Canada and in every one of the current regions of the Unitarian Universalist Association. In fact, every one of the 23 historic districts into which the association was once organized. The overwhelming majority of states and nearly every Canadian province with a Unitarian Universalist congregation. The congregations have ranged in size from 16 to 1,600 and then some. Many have been entirely lay-led, while others have had more staff than the smallest of these congregations have members. I've helped to mediate more than 40 conflicts in about 36 congregations, some having chosen to avail themselves of my help more than once by bringing me back for new fights. And I've been involved in more ministerial and staff transitions than I can count or even recall. Beyond this, I've studied the extensive literature on congregational life in North America, toured dozens of congregations from a variety of different traditions, and engaged with counterparts from 24 denominations to share experiences and insights. I'm neither bragging nor complaining, simply revealing to you that I've been around when it comes to religious communities. And I have yet to find a perfect one, the ideal church. I've seen congregations that might be described as optimal, at least within their context and time, but never an ideal one. All have been somehow blemished, somehow scarred. I've also seen some pretty troubled congregations with seemingly intractable conflicts and difficult personalities, but I have never yet encountered a hopeless congregation, at least not directly, although the history of religion does contain examples of congregations so toxic that they might have been considered beyond redemption. I don't know any personally. All of the congregations I've worked with have been perfectly imperfect, and almost every one of them has been perfectly wonderful. Still, we cling to our fantasies of the ideal church and routinely find ourselves disappointed when they prove to be, gasp, human institutions, not so obviously ordained by God. But what else can a church be except human? It's curious to me that we're most likely to set ideal standards for the institutions and people on which we most depend. Our families, our political structures, our clinics, our schools, our friends, our churches, especially our churches, even though we are sure to be disappointed in nearly every case. Someone I know made me slip in the nearly. We don't expect to find an ideal grocery store or a perfect repair shop, And while we might sometimes say we've found a perfect parking spot, we don't really mean it that way. So why apply the idolatry of the ideal to church? It's a surefire prescription for disappointment. I once worked with a congregation that had a recurring cycle of conflict. It was so predictable you could have set your watch by it, or at least predicted the year. Founded as a lay-led fellowship in the 1950s, it had experienced its first serious conflict about a decade into its existence. And from that point onward, it hosted a new conflict every 3 years or so, by which I mean every 3 years, give or take about 3 months. Over the span of 3 decades, the people changed almost completely. The issues varied, but the conflict cycle repeated itself again and again and again. New players, same old script. Almost like clockwork. The presenting symptoms were generally similar. Someone would take offense at something. Someone else would blame a third party. And then someone would threaten to resign from the board or the congregation itself, but not without first taking hostages and inflicting emotional casualties. When the call came for me to respond to one of their conflicts, my first, I had already been warned about the pattern, which seemed set in the congregation's DNA. I showed up full of hubris, expecting to interrupt this recurring pattern. And I did, but only by accident. Over the course of a very long weekend, a very, very long weekend, the longest of all possible long weekends, I found myself negotiating a 3-point conflict, and every time I thought we were close to a resolution, it would fall apart. Someone would say, but, and it would all collapse. As I became increasingly tired and the meetings went on, I let down my guard. I lost my professional distance, and I became embroiled in the conflict myself, which is how I helped resolve it and how I helped break the pattern. In other words, I snapped. I could have been a cinema character that weekend. I snapped. Jack Nicholson could have played me. And in a moment of frustration, I fired the board. And I appointed new officers to serve on an interim basis until the next annual meeting. We're not going to do that today, and besides, the annual meeting is only this afternoon. But you get the drama of this picture. The annual meeting was only a few months away. Now, let me be clear. Denominational officials in our tradition do not have the authority to dismiss boards and appoint new ones. Nor do I recommend this course of action as generally effective or allowable means of mediating a conflict. The executive vice president of the Unitarian Universalist Association asked me never to do this again in my future work with congregations. But it worked. They let me do it. We were all shocked, and the arrangement held until a chastened congregation selected a new board to lead them. The most interesting thing to me was that 3 years later, no new conflict presented itself. nor 3 years after that. I can't tell you there hasn't been a conflict since then. I honestly don't know. But I can tell you that the recurring cycle and its customary pattern was interrupted. I've worked with several congregations with long-tenured ministers. And by long-tenured, I mean 2 decades or more. And they seem generally stable and healthy from the outside. Most of them were. In a few cases, the ministers had obviously reinvented themselves at strategic points in their ministries, and I recall pointing out to one congregation that they had transitioned through each of the 4 size zones we commonly use to describe congregations, while explaining that their minister had effectively modeled 3 distinct styles of ministry through their tenure, each one appropriate for the congregation's evolution. This minister was more than capable of growing into the next style needed, and did so, but they decided to do it elsewhere rather than reinvent themselves one more time in the same place. By contrast, in other congregations I've worked with, long-tenured ministers had stagnated at some point and become a source of inertia, even internal conflict, when things appeared from the outside to still be going well. In one congregation, which belonged to a different denomination, so I feel free to talk about it, my explicit task as a consultant was to ensure that the minister kept a 5-year-old promise to retire at the end of that year. All of these congregations were highly successful by any external measure, yet each of them had internal challenges that you can scarcely imagine, even outright conflicts that betrayed their imperfections, or, if you prefer, their growing edges. Today, social media is changing the way in which congregants interact with one another, sometimes for the better, sometimes for the worse. And each new development in online communications further complicates the delicate fabric of congregational life, because we've taken our conflicts to the airwaves. The complexity of the modern congregation grows with each new technological development, as do the opportunities for falling short of its own ideals, such as when a minister or an important lay leader sends a confidential and at least mildly inflammatory message to the all-church email list instead of the person they intended. Oops. If we really want to understand religious communities and avoid the idolatry of the ideal church, which is grounded in the unwholesome cult of perfectionism, we would be well advised to turn to the humorists like Stephen Leacock or Garrison Keillor, who lovingly lampoon churches and their inevitable foibles. Both of these humorists loved the church, and both could hardly restrain themselves in pointing out the imperfections of the very churches they loved. I stand with Peter Fleck, who asserted that we need the liberal church not in spite of its shortcomings, but because of its shortcomings. Human institutions will be imperfect because people are imperfect. The liberal church is not an ideal institution that we can enshrine on a pedestal or appreciate only during the silence before the service begins, but a school of imperfection, fraught with differences to be reconciled, prone to lapses yet open to forgiveness, often uncomfortable yet holding the prospect of comfort, where love is the spirit that sustains it, even though love is sometimes hard. I go to church because I fall below my own standards and need to be constantly brought back to them, asserted A. Powell Davies, who is the foremost voice for liberal religion in North America when he served All Souls Church in Washington, D.C. during the middle decades of the 20th century. I must have my conscience sharpened, he went on to say, sharpened until it goads me to the most thorough and responsible thinking and action of which I am capable. Because I must feel again the love I owe my fellow men and women. I must not only hear about it, but feel it. And in church, I do. Why then is it so hard for us to accept that the congregations we belong to fall short too, just as individuals do, even the best ones? If each and every one of us falters in striving to reach our most cherished ideals, and on a pretty regular basis, why do we expect our spiritual communities to attain standards that we ourselves struggle to attain even at the best of times? If our own family dynamics are difficult, how reasonable is it to demand that our congregations should be easier to understand and navigate than Thanksgiving dinner with our cousins, when our congregations are far more complex in their composition than our own extended families? We meet each other as friends and neighbors anywhere and everywhere, but seldom do so in the consciousness of our soul's deepest yearnings, asserted Powell Davies. In church, we do. In a way that leaves us knowing that we all have the same yearning, the same spiritual need of assurance of faith and hope. We are brought together at the highest level possible. We are not merely an audience. We are a congregation. And so we gather week after week, not because this is an ideal place, far from it, but because this is where we come in search of our ideals, knowing full well that human institutions are imperfect because we are imperfect, all the while feeling the love that we owe to others because it is the love that we long for ourselves. Please join in hymn number 6, Just as Long as I Have Breath.